This family photograph from 1901 looks completely normal, until you learn what happened just 3 days after it was taken. What you're about to discover will change how you see this image forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single photograph became evidence in one of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. I'm investigating historical mysteries that'll keep you awake at night. Today's case starts in Hartford, Connecticut, 1901, but I promise you this isn't your typical history lesson. Look at their faces. The father's defensive posture. The mother's tense shoulders. That teenage daughter staring right at you with knowledge number 14-year-old should have. Something was already wrong when this photo was taken. We're talking mysterious visitors, hidden letters, financial schemes, and a crime scene that made experienced investigators question everything they thought they knew about murder. But before we dive into the horror, let me set the scene. Hartford, Connecticut, 1901. This is America in transition. The Second Industrial Revolution is transforming everything. Photography has exploded in popularity since the 1880s. For the first time in history, middle-class families can afford to document their lives in ways previous generations never imagined. Meet this family. From the outside. Living the American dream. The father, a successful fabric store owner who arrived from rural Vermont 15 years earlier with nothing but ambition. Through pure hard work, he built a thriving business serving Hartford's growing population. His wife, deeply involved in the local Presbyterian church, organizing charity events, the picture of respectability. Together, they'd had 5 children, though only 3 survived childhood, a tragic but common reality when infant mortality rates were devastating. This photograph was taken at a well-established studio by a professional photographer whose business records show he specialized in family portraits and weddings. The process was still slow and methodical. Subjects had to remain perfectly still for several seconds during exposure, which explains their serious expressions. But here's what nobody knew. This family was hiding devastating secrets. And I mean devastating. The father you see here? 3 days later, authorities would find him collapsed by the front window, victim of extreme violence. But here's where it gets weird. Let me tell you about that morning. October something 1901. It's a Thursday. The neighbors, a woman living next door, first hears raised voices around 10 a.m. Then screaming. Then silence. Now this is 1901. People don't interfere in domestic matters. There's a huge social taboo against getting involved in other families' business. So she waits. She hesitates. But when the screaming starts again an hour later, louder, more desperate, more terrifying, she calls her husband for help. They approach the house together. Knock on the door. No answer. The front windows have their curtains drawn, which isn't unusual during the day. But something in the atmosphere, something in the silence, tells them this is wrong. They decide to get the sheriff. Sheriff arrives around noon with 2 deputies. They also try knocking, calling out to the residents. Total silence. Now, forcing entry into someone's home without clear evidence of a crime? That's serious business with major legal and social implications. But the combination of the neighbors' reports and the complete lack of response convinces them something terrible has happened. They break down the door. What they find will haunt this small Connecticut town for generations. The scene is concentrated mainly in the living room, the same environment where this family had likely posed for earlier portraits. The father is collapsed near the front window, injuries indicating extreme violence. Multiple weapons or methods were used, something the experienced coroner had never seen before, even by the violent standards of that era. The mother is found in the hallway leading to the stairs, positioned like she was trying to flee upstairs. Her injuries suggest she was running, trying to escape whatever was happening in that living room. The 2 youngest children, the boy around 8, the girl around 6, they're discovered in what appears to be a closet under the stairs, clinging to each other. But here's the thing that really disturbed investigators. The way they were positioned indicated someone had deliberately placed them there. Someone, in the midst of whatever chaos was happening, took time to try to protect these children. But that teenage girl from our photo? The one with those knowing eyes? She's found in the kitchen near the back door. And here's what's really going to mess with your head. That same morning, neighbors saw her leaving for school at 8 a.m. She waved at Mrs. Henderson, who was watering plants in her garden. She seemed completely normal. Polite greeting, usual routine, nothing unusual whatsoever. But she never made it to school. Somehow, at some point between 8 a.m. and when the screaming started at 10 a.m., she turned around and came back home. What made a 14-year-old girl abandon her normal school routine and walk back into what would become her final moments? The school confirmed she hadn't attended classes that day, but this was only discovered during the investigation. Her teacher mentioned that in the previous few days, the girl had seemed distracted and worried. When questioned about it, she'd insisted everything was fine at home. So what was she worried about? What did she know? The initial investigation revealed details that complicated any attempt to understand what had happened. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of anyone external having entered the house. Doors were locked from the inside. Windows closed and secured. No evidence of robbery. Money and jewelry remained untouched in their usual places. Everything pointed to a domestic tragedy. But the specific details raised questions that even experienced investigators couldn't answer. The official story? Murder-suicide. Financial ruin drove the father to madness. Case closed. But hold on, because that's where this story gets really interesting. See, investigators found the father's makeshift office in a small back room. Among his personal papers, they discovered letters indicating severe financial difficulties. The successful business everyone thought was thriving? It had actually been facing devastating problems for at least 6 months. Letters revealed substantial debts with suppliers, threats of foreclosure on the house, desperate attempts to secure loans that were systematically denied by local banks. One letter, dated just a week before the tragedy, was from a lawyer informing him that the store would be closed and its assets auctioned off unless a specific amount was paid by the end of the month. This discovery completely changed the authorities' perspective. Suddenly there was an apparent motive. Financial pressure combined with social shame of impending bankruptcy in a small community where reputation was everything could create an unsustainable psychological situation. But other elements didn't fit this neat narrative. For example, there was evidence the family had eaten breakfast as usual that morning. Dishes were in the sink with food remnants, indicating a recent, unhurried meal. This suggested the violence erupted suddenly, not as the result of a premeditated decision made the night before. The father's activities the night before tell an interesting story. 3 stops. First, the local pharmacy where he purchased an unusually large amount of headache medicine, claiming his wife was suffering from severe migraines. Then a hardware store where he asked about a specific type of rope but ended up buying nothing. Finally, a bar near the commercial center. The bartender's account is particularly intriguing. The man had consumed several shots of whiskey, apparently unusual for him, as he was known as moderate in his drinking habits. More importantly, he engaged in a long conversation with another customer about financial pressures and supporting a family during difficult times. The conversation grew progressively darker, with comments about how some men reach the point where they can no longer see viable alternatives to their problems. That doesn't sound like someone planning violence against his family. That sounds like someone terrified, desperate, maybe even looking for advice or alternatives. But then, 2 years later, something happens that changes everything. Workers renovating the house find a hidden letter. Tucked between floorboards in the master bedroom, in a spot the original investigators never examined. Handwritten by the mother, addressed to her sister living in another state, dated 3 weeks before the tragedy. And what it says flips this entire case upside down. She wasn't desperate. She was optimistic. There was a buyer for the business. They were planning to move to Oregon where her brother had offered to help establish a new venture. This wasn't a family in despair. This was a family with hope, planning for the future. But the letter mentions something else. Something that opens up an entirely different theory about what really happened. She was worried about strange visitors who had begun appearing at the store and their home. People who asked questions about their business and seemed to know details about their finances that should have been private information. Further investigation revealed that 3 unknown men had been seen in the area during the weeks leading up to the tragedy. They'd stayed at the local hotel for short periods, paid in cash, and seemed to have far more resources than typical travelers passing through town. A hotel employee remembered them specifically because of their unusual behavior and apparent wealth. This new information suggested the possibility that the tragedy might have been the result of external pressures beyond the family's known financial difficulties. Here's what I think really happened, and this theory has gained credibility among modern researchers. This family stumbled into something much bigger than simple financial trouble. We're talking about the early 1900s, the absolute Wild West of investment schemes and financial fraud. Ponzi schemes targeting successful merchants were everywhere. The formula was simple. Promise huge returns on investments, take their money, disappear when it all collapses. The era was notorious for various types of fraud specifically designed to target prosperous small-town merchants. These schemes exploited the trust and ambition of local communities, moving from town to town like financial locusts. Multiple similar cases happened in nearby towns over about a 2-year period. Same exact pattern. successful merchant families, sudden financial ruin, and tragic endings. This wasn't random despair. This was organized crime systematically destroying families across Connecticut and surrounding states. Those mysterious visitors? Probably connected to whatever scheme the family got caught up in. When it went bad, when people started asking questions or threatening to expose the operation, things got dangerous fast. The presence of these unknown men in town could have been related to either the operation or collapse of such a scheme. Modern analysis of similar cases from the period reveals evidence of organized criminal networks that specifically targeted merchant families, exploited their investments, and then eliminated witnesses when investigations got too close. But here's the part that really haunts me about this photograph. Modern digital analysis, technology that wasn't available in 1901, reveals secrets hidden in this image. Someone moved slightly during the long exposure required, creating an almost imperceptible duplication in part of the image. Despite their composed appearance, there was underlying tension that made it difficult for at least one family member to remain completely still. The analysis also revealed that the photographer made last-minute adjustments to the lighting during the session, evidenced by slightly inconsistent shadows. This suggests there was something in the family's appearance or behavior that led him to attempt improvements that wouldn't normally have been necessary. Even the photographer sensed something was wrong. The family had actually commissioned 2 different photographic sessions during the same period. This studio photograph we're looking at was taken first, but they'd also hired a photographer to take portraits in their home the following week. That second session never happened. It was scheduled for the week after they died. The mother had been very specific about what she wanted from the home session. She wanted photographs showing the family in their natural environment, as opposed to the formality of the studio. She wanted images that could be sent to distant relatives to show how well established they were in their new life. Does that sound like someone planning to end it all? She was thinking about the future, about family connections, about showing off their success to relatives back east. This makes the speed with which the situation apparently deteriorated in those final days even more mysterious and suspicious. But there's something else about this photograph that modern experts discovered. The technical analysis revealed not just movement during exposure, but specific details about the family's positioning that suggest they were uncomfortable, anxious, or under some kind of stress. The father's posture, that defensive crossed-arm position, isn't typical of family portrait conventions from the period. Usually, the patriarch would stand in a central, prominent position symbolizing his role as head of the household. Instead, he appears almost protective, defensive. The mother's seated position shows tension in her shoulders, hands firmly placed in her lap in a way that seems more like an attempt to hold herself together than a relaxed pose. But it's the teenage daughter who draws the most attention. That direct stare into the camera with unusual intensity. There's something in her eyes that suggests forced maturity, as if she carried knowledge or worries beyond her years. She knew something was wrong. And I think she came home that morning because she sensed danger. Maybe she overheard something at school, or maybe she just had a feeling. Maybe she was trying to warn her family. Maybe she was trying to save them. The fact that she left for school normally but then returned suggests she received information or had a realization that made her abandon her routine and rush back home. What 14-year-old makes that decision unless something is seriously wrong? Here's what I think happened in those final hours. The family wasn't victims of the father's financial despair. They were victims of something far more sinister. The mysterious visitors, the financial scheme, the organized criminal network, it all came to a head that morning. Maybe the family figured out they'd been scammed. Maybe they threatened to go to authorities. Maybe they had evidence that could bring down the entire operation. The teenage daughter somehow learned about the danger, perhaps through overheard conversations or warnings from someone who knew what was coming. She rushed home to warn her parents, but arrived too late to prevent the tragedy, only in time to become another victim. The crime scene was then staged to look like a murder-suicide. The locked doors, the positioning of the bodies, the removal of any evidence pointing to external involvement. Professional criminals who knew how to make their work look like domestic tragedy. This would explain the inconsistencies that puzzled investigators. The sudden eruption of violence after a normal breakfast, the complex sequence of events throughout the house, the multiple weapons or methods used, the strange positioning of the children in the closet. Someone took time during the violence to hide those children, trying to protect them. That's not the behavior of a father in homicidal rage, that's someone trying to save lives while under attack. The investigation was deliberately limited and quickly closed because powerful people wanted this case buried. The official murder-suicide verdict protected whoever was really responsible and prevented deeper investigation into the criminal network operating in the area. Multiple families destroyed, multiple tragedies blamed on financial despair and domestic violence, while the real perpetrators moved on to the next town, the next victims. This photograph isn't just a family portrait. It's evidence of a cover-up that's lasted over a century. It's a document of people living their final days, completely unaware that they'd stumbled into something that would destroy them. They posed thinking about their future in Oregon, about second chances, about the business deal that would save them, about hope. Instead, they became victims of organized crime, their story twisted and buried to protect the real killers. The local press, following sensationalist patterns of the era, quickly turned the case into a national story about the hidden dangers of modern life. But they never questioned the official narrative. Newspapers from larger cities sent reporters who accepted the murder-suicide explanation without investigating the inconsistencies. The photograph was reproduced in several publications, usually accompanied by speculation about what each family member might have been thinking when the image was captured. But no one asked the right questions about what they might have known, what they might have discovered, what might have made them dangerous to powerful criminals. Years later, when other researchers began systematically documenting local history, they discovered at least 3 other families in the region who had faced similar circumstances during the same period. Same mysterious financial troubles, same sudden violent endings, same official explanations of domestic tragedy. But some of these families had managed to overcome their difficulties without resorting to violence, which raised questions about what specific factors had made certain families targets while others escaped. Modern economic analysis revealed that the financial crisis affecting small-town merchants during this period was indeed severe, but it was also being deliberately manipulated by organized criminal networks. These weren't random business failures. They were systematic targeting operations designed to identify and exploit vulnerable families with assets worth stealing. The pattern suggests a sophisticated criminal organization that moved from town to town, identified prosperous merchants, drew them into fraudulent investment schemes, cleaned out their assets, and then eliminated witnesses who might expose the operation. The families that survived were probably those who recognized the fraud early enough to avoid deeper involvement, or who didn't pose a threat to the criminals' continued operations. But this family? They figured it out too late. They had evidence, they were asking questions, they were planning to move away and potentially report what they'd discovered. That made them dangerous. That teenage girl staring at us from this photograph? She represents all the victims of crimes that were covered up, stories that were buried, truths that were hidden to protect powerful criminals. Her intense gaze asks questions we're still trying to answer more than a century later. What did she know? What was she trying to tell us? What secrets died with her that morning in October 1901? This photograph remains in a local historical archive, occasionally viewed by researchers and curious individuals who stumble upon the story. It continues to exert its peculiar power to provoke questions about justice, truth, and the invisible forces that shape our lives. For those who look at it with knowledge of its history, it represents a moment frozen in time when 5 people were alive, together, and apparently safe. A moment that in retrospect seems simultaneously ordinary and precious, but also charged with foreboding and hidden danger. The tragedy that followed serves as a grim reminder that appearances can be deeply deceiving, that even families that seem most stable and prosperous may be facing pressures and challenges invisible to outside observers. But it also serves as a reminder that some tragedies aren't random acts of despair, they're deliberate acts of violence committed by people who profit from others' destruction and use their power to hide their crimes. This story remains relevant today in an era when financial fraud, organized crime, and cover-ups by powerful interests continue to destroy innocent families. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental patterns remain the same. If stories like this fascinate you, there are dozens more waiting to be told. Hidden in archives, forgotten in newspapers, dismissed by investigators who couldn't see the bigger picture or were prevented from looking too closely. Subscribe if you want to uncover more mysteries that'll change how you see history. Because trust me, the past holds secrets darker than you can imagine, and some of those secrets are still protecting people who should have been brought to justice long ago. The truth about what happened to this family may never be fully known, but their story deserves to be told. They deserve to be remembered not as victims of domestic tragedy, but as victims of organized crime whose murders were covered up to protect the real killers. That photograph will keep asking questions until someone finally provides the answers this family never got.